Welcome to Power Parsha. This is lesson number 2, and we're building momentum as we move along, which is great. And it's second Power Parsha, and it's the second Torah portion of the year and of all of the Torah. So we're in the Torah portion this week of Noah. And we're going to focus on some wordplay today. How does that sound? So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to be able to read some text from this week's Torah portion. Okay? And actually, it actually starts not with this week's Torah portion, but with a verse from last week's Torah portion. Okay, so at the end of last week's Torah portion, after it goes through the story of creation, it goes through the story of Adam and Eve and the sin of the tree of knowledge and on, and then it talks about all the different generations. And then the end of the parsha is kind of depressing, where we go from creation and all that promise to the degradation of mankind, to the extent that God is regretting having ever embarked on this endeavor. So what happens here? Towards the end, one of the last verses of last week's Torah portion is Vayar Hashem ki rabba ra'as ha'adam ba'aretz v'chol yetzer machris liber rak kolayim. That Hashem, God saw how great was human wickedness on earth, how every plan devised by the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. Right now, what is Rabba Ras? I see I missed my handout here is a little bit out of order. So let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're good. That's Rabba Ras Adam, right? Let's remember that word. Rabba Ras Adam. Great, right? Great was human wickedness. Rabba, great. Let's move on now to our Torah portion, Noah, and the flood. So it says, the verse says that on the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst apart, and the floodgates of the sky broke open. Okay, in the Hebrew, nifku kol mainois tohoim rabba. Yeah, the fountains of the great deep burst apart. Again, the word great, rabba, right? That word appears. So we have great wickedness, right? Man's great was human wickedness, and the great deep burst apart as the retribution. God said basically that humanity is corrupt, the world is corrupt. I'm going to bring a flood, I'm going to wipe it out. How did the flood come? It came with the fountains of the great deep bursting apart. Okay, so let's look at Rashi, the classic commentary on the Torah, and he says on these words of the verse in our Parsha, right, the great deep. So it says Rashi, and quoting from the Talmud, measure for measure. They had sinned with Rabba Ra'asa Adam, great was the evil of man, or in our translation here, great was human wickedness on earth, right? The verse we quoted earlier, i.e. their sin is described by the word Rabba, great, and they were therefore punished by Tahoim Rabba, the great deep, i.e. the expression of great is used of the instrument by which they were punished for the great sin. Okay, so Rashi notes this sort of word connection, right? So there's a little wordplay here, right? It says Rabba Ra'as Adam, that man's sinning and depravity was described as Rabba, as great, and then God's paying man back, the retribution was Rabba, also with this idea of great. There's this concept that it's measure for measure. God responds in the way we behave. God responds in kind, right? So it's measure for measure. Okay. Another wordplay, but looking at the clock, I don't know if we'll be able to circle back to this, but let's throw it in anyway. That was from the beginning of this week's Torah portion. The end of the Torah portion talks about the Tower of Babel, right? So we're familiar with the story of the Tower. So the story of the flood occupies most of this week's Torah narrative. And then it goes from that, it transitions a little bit of other events afterwards until we come to the Tower of Babel. What was the Tower of Babel? So let's take a look at this next text here. And they said, come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves. Else we shall be scattered all over the world. I like that word. Else we shall be scattered. Okay, this translation compliments of Sepharia. Right? So come, let us build us a city. Right? And in the Hebrew, Vayoimru, they said, Hava, come, let us, Nivna Lanu, build for us a city. Okay? What happens? So the people they get together, they rally around to build a city and a tower in Babel that will go up to the sky to build a name for themselves. Exactly what their sin was is not relevant really to our conversation today, but God is clearly not happy. Whatever the offense was, God's not happy. So what does God say? God says, let us then go down and confound their speech there. So when God is, and what was, in other words, what was the punishment for the Tower of Babel? It says that everybody was united as one, and they had this big plan and this project of building this tower. And God says, I'm going to separate them. I'm going to disperse them. I'm going to confuse their languages. They're going to be speaking, they're not going to be able to communicate with each other. They're going to have to disperse. So the response to the act of the building of the Tower of Babel was a dispersion. of those people that had rallied together. Okay, what's the term used to describe the people building? Hava. Let us. What's the term that God uses to introduce how He's going to respond to them? Hava. The same word. Hava. Let us. The same word. Right. Let's see. What does Rashi say? I don't have Rashi here. No, yeah, Rashi's right here. Hava, come. Measure for measure. Rashi again, almost the same thing, right? They had said, come, let us build. He meted out to them correspondingly saying, come, let us go down, right? Again, measure for measure, where the people sin with Hava and God responds with Hava. That's the response. Okay. So obviously, when we have things like this, and this is not an uncommon thing to find in the Talmud and in Midrash, here the first quote was from the Talmud, the second was from the Midrash. So our oral tradition is full of this kind of analysis of the Torah and these words that they link together. Now, there's a certain symmetry, I guess, in the writing, obviously, and we know, obviously, the Hebrew language is very deep and profound, and there's so many possibilities. But really, it's not just like we cherry pick two words and say, oh, look, they have this word here, they have this word there. Let's make a Dvar Torah. Let's turn it into a power and Parsha. Obviously, there's a connection between them, and it's conveyed with the link of these two words, right? So, in other words, by the sages pointing out the connection between the symmetry or the connection between these two words, the measure for measure, it tells us something about the nature of the sin and the nature of the response. So we can learn something deeper, right? It's not just semantics. Okay, so let's delve into that for a moment. There are three types of sin. You've got sin that is a sin that's within a person, within your own, within your psyche and your emotions. You've got sin inside that relate to your body, or let's say sins that relate to your mind, sins that relate to your emotions and your body, and sins that relate to your actions. Right. So, what would be a sin of the mind? Sin of the mind is having, and I said I wasn't going to start drawing parallels. We have an intelligent audience, so everybody can do whatever they want. But the point is, it's obviously, I think, a very timely message here. The sin of the mind is having really bad ideas and holding very bad views and opinions, right? So, for instance, rejecting God, for instance, would be regarded as a sin, right? We're commanded to know God, to believe it, not just to believe, because you can't really command a belief, but to know God, and so to reject God, that's a bad, right? That would be a sinful sort of pattern of thought, right? Then you have sins that relate to your emotions. You have desires. We all have desires, and we have emotion that's born from our desires. So we have good desires, right? Certain desires that are, maybe we want to make the world a better place. That's a great desire to have. But then we have sometimes sinful desires or lustful desires. Those are also desires. So we have sins that are sins of passion of desire. And then you have sins that relate to money and property, where you yearn for somebody else's stuff, essentially, right? Now, what's the difference between these types of sin? The difference is that most of our sins in our mind come from ignorance. They come from ignorance. So if you meet somebody who can set you straight, you'll get your mind right, right? Your sin is one of ignorance or confusion, lack of understanding. So study more, learn more, understand more, read up, educate yourself, and we can straighten your mind out. That's potentially possible. Sins of lust, of passion, eventually we all get old. And as we get old, that impulse starts to decrease a little bit, right? It decreases. Eventually, there's one type of sin that endures till the day you die, and that is, I'll maybe use it loosely. I think, and I think it'll apply. All these fit to that category. Money, obviously, the desire for money, and therefore, pursuing money in ill-gotten ways, right, in inappropriate ways to be able to get money. It has to do with power, property, any of those things that are desires that not only do they not seem to decrease with age, they actually seem to increase. They actually seem to increase. That's a desire that doesn't go away. So when we talk about having bad ideas, we can have a debate, we can have a conversation, we can educate ourselves, we can work that out, we can solve that problem. We talk about the sins of lust, eventually you're just not going to have the strength anymore. But when we talk about disrespecting other people's space and property, when we talk about the desire to control everyone and everything and have everything for yourself, there's no way to sort of stop that freight train from once it leaves the station. And here we find something very interesting, which is in the beginning of the Parsha, God says, in the beginning of our Parsha, Noach, it says like this. If you look down here also on the handout, the earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. I'll read that in Hebrew for emphasis. Fatishachet haaretz lifnei Elokim, fatimalei haaretz chamas. Yeah, that's this week's Parsha. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. Says Rashi. Let's go to our go-to commentator on the verse. And Rashi says the earth was corrupt. It means lewdness and idolatry. And he brings Rashi cites two examples from verses where we see this term of tishaches, right, of corruption as it relates to idolatry and as it relates to adultery, right? So we see that vatishachet haaretz lifnei Elokim, the earth became corrupt. That represents the first two categories of sin, right? Sins of the mind, right? A relationship with God and those perspectives, and sins of the heart, adultery and that kind of corruption. But then when it says vatimalei haaretz chamas, what does that mean? So it says Rashi, ki hishchis kol basar, I'm sorry, what is that? So we say lawlessness. 1 second, let me just read this. Let's go to the next Rashi. And the earth was filled with violence, right? Or in the original translation, we had lawlessness. Here in the Rashi translation is violence. It's the same, which means robbery. That's the third type of sin. That's the third type of sin. So why does God bring the flood? We see that the world, what God is saying here in that verse we just read, is that the world became utterly corrupt in all three types of sinning. So what prompts God to bring to go about destroying the world, starting new and fresh? Let's look at the next verse here. God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. I am about to destroy them with the earth, right? What does God say? Why am I putting an end to it? Not because vatishachet haaretz lifnei Elokim, not because of adultery and idolatry, but because of Hamas, because the world is filled with violence. Their fate was sealed. Look at Rashi. Their fate was sealed only on account of the sin of robbery. Robbery, again, is that third type of sin, the pursuit of power and the pursuit of other people's property, the pursuit of money, right? Essentially, that all relates to this idea of money. I'm going to stop sharing because that's the end of our handout. But what's the point here? The point is, as we explained before, when you have the different types of sins that are destined to eventually, you can get around them, you can negotiate them, you can tire from them, right? Eventually, you move on. But the one that remains with all that vim and vigor and just can go till the day you die, that is this idea of the desire for money and power and property in that kind of way. And that's the one that God says, that's the reason that this is not sustainable. That's something that we have to put a stop to. And now let's just finish off because we started 6 minutes late, so we have like 2 more minutes. Let's circle back to the end of the parsha about the Tower of Babel, when we talked about Hava, right? Let us. So there, what does that mean? So we talked about 3 types of sin, but there are 2 types of sinners. Okay, you've got a sinner who commits his crimes as acts of passion, or in a moment he snapped, he was overcome by desire, and he did something he shouldn't have done. Right? He had a bad moment, a moment of weakness, a moment of whatever, a moment of insanity, whatever it is. You have sins of passion, crimes of passion. Then you have premeditated. We know even in secular law, in Western law, we know there's a difference between a crime of passion versus a premeditated crime, right? So, and they're treated differently. The horrors of them, the impacts of them are the same, and we're not morally equating with it, but it's a different type of crime, and reflects differently on the committer of the crime. So what does it mean when the people say, let us build this for man? What they were saying is they were building an ideology, a philosophy that was corrupt, but they were doing it intentionally, deliberately. It wasn't it wasn't out of fear, it wasn't a reaction, it wasn't because of something that, it was something that was premeditated, something orchestrated, premeditated, determined, practiced, and rehearsed, and prepared, and all orchestrated in a way to do something that God found displeasing, unfavorable. So what is God's response? Hava, I'm going to do premeditated. What does that mean? Sometimes, we already know, we quoted in these 2 instances, this idea of measure for measure. There's a saying by the teaching by the Maggid of Mezrich, a very famous Hasidic saying that says, Dam alamayla mimach. No, the Mishnah, the ethics of our father says, know what is above you. Right? And the context of that in the Mishnah, the simple meaning of it is that you want to stay on the straight and narrow. Just remember that God's above you. right? Know what is above you, that there's always somebody above you. You're not alone. You're not, right? But the Maggid translates those words literally. He says, Da malamayla, know what is above, mimcha is from you. What happens above comes from you. We determine what goes on in heaven. In other words, it relates to this idea of measure for measure. If we behave in a certain way, God responds and reciprocates in kind. So sometimes what God does is he says, you're rejecting me? Okay, you want to reject me, you don't recognize my protection and my taking care of you, I'll leave you to the whims of the world. What'll happen? Whatever happens. Obviously, we don't have, this is not the time and space to get into the details of these concepts. I'm just touching on it, right? But then there are times where God says, you know what, I'm going to come and I'm going to do something intentionally. Right? Obviously, everything is done intentionally. But again, that's a distinction. For instance, in the story of Purim, one of the ways of understanding that the great threat that the Jewish people were facing was that the Jewish people put their trust in Achashverosh, in a maniac, anti-Semitic king. So God says, you want to put your faith in him? Okay, you put your eggs in that basket. Let's see how it turns out with you, right? And what happens? Just let's let it play out. And then they face that threat, right? In other words, a measure for measure kind of thing. Then there are times that you premeditate and God premeditates. So what we have here is, without focusing on the negative response, right? The punishment, the retribution, the flooding of the world, or the disruption of the people at the Tower of Babel. What's the lesson for us? The lesson for us is as follows. We have to know that the antidote to all of these corruptions, to the types of sin, and to the sinning and the sinner himself, is this idea of Rabbah, of great, and of Hava, of let us. In other words, Torah, you want to get your head right, you want to get your heart right, you want to get even your behavior right, you have to throw yourself into the Torah, which is great. Aruka Me'eretz Mida, the Torah is so vast, it's so great. There's also, we can refer to the Torah that way. We have to study Torah, we have to put ourselves into the words of Torah, educate ourselves Jewishly. And if we can do that, we can get ourselves straightened out. So our response has to be a rabbah in terms of investing ourselves in Torah. And then there's the performance of mitzvahs, the performance of good deeds. Every mitzvah that we do, every blessing we make, every prayer we say involves preparation. The word hava is let us, preparation, organization. Let's organize. It's not something that's done sort of by rote and not something that's done absentmindedly. It's something that's done with intention, right? So we need to be intentional about our behaviors. We have to do things with intention when we can, and specifically good things. Do positive things, and we do them with that intention, because you can't do something and do it well without setting an intention beforehand. You can't pray, and the prayer is a meaningful, impactful prayer for you if it wasn't with an intention that was set, right? We set an intention before we pray, and then we keep an intention while we're praying. When we do a mitzvah, before we do the mitzvah, we set an intention. We make the blessing, which is sort of a preparation, setting an intention for the act that we're going to perform. So when we can have intention, and when we can go deep in our immersing ourselves in the Torah and the observance of mitzvahs, we can get ourselves right. We can get this world right, and eliminate whatever that serves as the antidote to eliminate any confusion, moral ambiguity, moral confusion, and corruption that might exist in the world. That's the way we set everything straight, and God willing, in its proper way.